Welcome to the Periphery. I'm your host, Alan Elrod, and I'm really excited for today's guest. Our guest is William Kristol, or Bill Kristol, as I'll call him in the show. You probably don't need an introduction to Bill's work, but he's currently an editor-at-large for the Bulwark. He was formerly a founder and worked for a long part of his career at the Weekly Standard. And prior to that was a big figure in Republican politics, having worked as chief of staff to Vice President Dan Quayle during the George H.W. Bush administration, coordinated with Republican politics over a long period of time, and is now, I think, a leading, to many, never-Trumper. And I'm really excited to have him on to talk today about all kinds of things from current stuff in politics to the sort of continued challenges we have in liberalism. So, Bill, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Good to be with you, Alan. How are things in Arkansas, in the great state of Arkansas?
They're good. We finally have sunshine absent the storms. So we've kind of pulled through, and I think down here in the spring it gets a little hectic whenever it gets warm. But now it's starting to look just like it's going to be nice.
Good.
Right. So
okay, enough of this apolitical stuff. Let's get to the serious stuff.
Yeah. Well, we can. I think we can probably find a way to politicize together.
Undoubtedly.
So the conversation. I'm so excited. Someone like you who's got such a long history of thinking really big and deeply about politics, not just being involved in political commentary and policy conversations, but has such a long career of thinking, I think, at the macro level about political ideas and political philosophy and sort of why we're doing what we're trying to do in any given sort of political moment. And so the conversation, just I guess a primer for people who are listening, that I'm really hoping we can weave in and out of for this hour, is about this challenge that is ongoing within American politics of liberalism and not just liberalism. I think, as some people take it, as a kind of project primarily of progressives, but a big tent idea that includes the center left and the center right, and the ways in which I think that we've had a lot of conversations particularly since 2016 about how those presuppositions are under assault. And I think obviously that assault hasn't receded. It's not going away anytime soon. So I kind of thought that, to my mind, one of the perfect examples of this that we could talk about that's been in the news is Ron DeSantis coming out in this press conference after finding out really that the Disney lawyers had sort of pulled one over on him, as lawyers for very large and successful corporations are wont to do. It's saying that, in response, Florida might sort of subsidize or authorize the building of some sort of state park or competitor. And then, kind of as he's throwing out these ideas, he says, oh, and maybe we'll build a prison next to Disney. And to me, when I heard that, I thought, well, this feels like the perfect example. Not only is this a Republican, so sort of supposedly pro-business party, continuing to go after a business, really for the purposes of just sort of punishing them for defying him on politics. But I can't think of a more kind of perfect symbol of a sort of would-be a more sort of authoritarian style governor than let's build a prison next to the place where everybody wants to take, their kids for summer holidays or Christmas or other things. So maybe let's start there. I'm curious, obviously there are some people who might say this is just sort of he's just throwing that out there as a joke or as a kind of, he's just being provocative. But how did you take that when you heard it?
Well, first, it's good to be with you. I took it as more of the same from DeSantis. I mean, you're right. People might minimize it as sort of just performative, just saying it. He's not necessarily going to do it. But if, thought about rewarding their friends and punishing their enemies, some of that's just classic graft and corruption. Some of it is much more subtle. Some of it is Tammany Hall. Some of it is on the right. Some of it is on the left, honestly. I mean, there are principles on both the right and among liberals that should prevent people from doing this and should prevent us from applauding politicians who do this. But there's always been a tendency to do it. But most of the time they did it in quietly, right? I mean, the normal thing you would do if you were a kind of bullying governor is you would have one of your people call up Disney and say, hey, give in on this or else, or have someone call someone else who would indirectly suggest this, or have a stooge go out there and suggest it. The fact that he wants to be the person who's suggesting it, for me, that's revealing. It shows how deep the Trumpism has gone, not just in the kind of authoritarianism and the disdain for markets and limited government and the rule of law, but in the kind of that these the voters apparently, or they think the voters want someone who will express these illiberal thoughts out loud and almost and vigorously and kind of triumphantly. And I mean, that's true of DeSantis' whole campaign. I mean, that, Trump's the nominee. He loses in 2020. They don't do very well in 2022, especially the election denying candidates who are in a way the ones most associated with Trump. You think if you're a successful Republican governor of one of the largest states, reelected by 19 points, you have a pretty straightforward campaign to run against Trump, right? I won by 19 points. A lot of his candidates lost. I'm a successful governor here. People are happy with me. I got a lot of independent and some Democratic votes, but I also stuck to conservative principles, blah, blah, blah. I don't like that woke stuff, and we're fighting that too. But I'm a successful governor. And Trump, with all due respect, he did some good stuff in his first term, but, this is what DeSantis DeSantis could have said in another year, I suppose, but enough already. And we probably can't win. And there's too much of this just posturing and things that turn voters off. I didn't do that. I won by 19 points. We need to win. We have to save the country from the dreaded Joe Biden, Democratic Party and all that nonsense. But still, that's a pretty incidentally, that's a pretty standard thing. That's certainly what a candidate would have done 10 years ago. And I think, incidentally, if DeSantis had done it even now, he'd be much better off than he is. And he didn't do it because he thinks, and there's some truth to this, of course, that that's not where today's Republican Party is. Today's Republican Party doesn't want to hear a normal, I'm a successful governor, I'm George W. Bush, I'm, Scott Walker, I'm whatever, know how to run things effectively, but also, culturally, I'm in sync with you. They want to hear the performative culture war stuff. DeSantis' bet is that they want to hear it so much that they want to hear it almost exclusively, and they want to hear him being more extreme than Trump. I mean, in some ways. And I think that's probably a bad bet because Trump has much more talent at doing this stuff, for one thing. But it's very revealed. DeSantis isn't stupid. He's been a successful politician. He's gone from first-term member of Congress to number 2 frontrunner for the Republican nomination in 8 years? Not bad, And but it's very revealing of where he thinks the party is, and maybe where the party is, that he felt this is the way he was going to run his campaign. And it does show how deep Trumpism is, unfortunately, how deeply embedded it is in today's Republican Party and in today's conservative movement.
There's something you raise in there about the base that I think speaks to a topic I was really eager to ask you about, which is this idea of appetite for these kinds of liberal politics. And, when you've mentioned correctly, and other people have mentioned correctly, that there's a liberalism on the left and the right. But something I think about, and I'm interested in how your thoughts would be on this, is it's also true, the mainstream consensus, center right and center left, is also, in many ways, it's a consensus of liberalism. And that comes with a certain set of presuppositions. Now, they don't always apply their main concerns in the same places. But one of the things that strikes me in this conversation is, we've seen comparisons, right, of DeSantis to sort of Viktor Orban, and the DeSantis administration has certainly, I think, embraced that in a way that's very uncomfortable. I was watching a sort of Vice does they do a good job of sending people around the world. And they sent one of the reporters to Budapest to talk to some of these American expats who've decamped to Hungary to kind of study Orbanism where it's happening. And Gladden Papin was sitting in a coffee shop with this reporter and talking about the thing he wanted to see change, why he sees himself as a post-liberal, is this idea of the need for people to be willing to use the state to sort of get what they want, right? If that means, and he says, if that means rewriting the Constitution to get things the way I want them to be, fine. If that means, applying the state power to achieve this particular sort of cultural war goal, fine. That's appropriate. And what that brings me back to, I think, in terms of this conversation about liberalism is, I think center-left liberals tend to focus on the state in a way that, some people might say, well, if you're left, that means you love the government. I think there's actually a strong strain of liberalism on both sides that is wary about government power. It just gets applied in different places. The center right has traditionally said, we're concerned about government constraining market activities. We don't want to see the government get too involved in the economy and in slowing down business or in sort of personal liberty issues. But on the center left, there's also a concern about things like there's been much more of a willingness maybe to criticize the criminal justice system, applications of state power when it comes to personal expression, right, in terms like of cultural war politics, right? So, the right of people to live lives as they see fit without sort of government imposing morality. And what concerns me about comments like Pappin's and politics like DeSantis is you're seeing a dismissal of both of those concerns, a sort of, sure, the state can be used to trample business, the state can be used to achieve cultural war gains. Really, the state can be used how we want to get what we want. And there seems to be a lot of people, maybe it's because there is a malaise to some degree among the broader public about the problems we face, and people both to the left and right who feel frustrated that the particular policy things they want to see done. Government works slowly, policy is not always easy to achieve, persuasion is hard, that resonate to one degree or another with this idea that, actually it's fine if we bulldoze people, at least on my issue. And once people come along who are willing to use a bulldozer on every issue, they're going to find an audience for that. I'm curious. I know I laid out I hope I walked through all of that in a sensible way, but I think to me that, that's what concerns me, is that there's not just that DeSantis is saying this stuff, but there seems to be still an appetite for it.
Yeah, both are a problem. Look, the way American politics worked for basically the last 70, 80 years was a center-left, center-right kind of compromise in which the center-right basically was able to hold the line on markets and prevent too much government, stifling of creativity and innovation and wealth creation in that area. And the center-left basically was able to protect civil liberties and increase them, actually. And each side went along with the other's main priority, but the others cared about it too. It's not like conservatives weren't libertarians. It's not like, to be fair, liberals didn't care about economic growth. Now, how to get it, they might have had a slightly different view, and they wanted to redistribute it more, but they cared about poor people getting, doing better, to be fair. So that was the consensus. I suppose one should step back and say, but that's a pretty rare consensus in world history. And maybe we shouldn't be surprised. You're too nice to them. You shouldn't just be concerned. You should really be angry. Maybe you are. And we need to fight it. It's not, glad Pappin is not just over in Hungary kind of learning from them. He's just signed up to be head of their foreign affairs propaganda arm, whatever they're calling it, some think tank for foreign affairs, to promote Hungary around the world. They are promoting illiberalism, and they are unabashedly doing it. And it's not because they don't understand things. No one told, they never read John Locke. They don't never read John Stuart Mill. They don't understand the case for limited government. They don't understand that it could come back and bite them. They do not like liberal democracy, and they are signed up with people who are opposed to it. Orban is one version of that. The Republican cheerleading for Putin is really a much more horrifying, even but connected example of this. And then there were different strains of it and different degrees of it. I don't mean they're not all, pro Putin or like Putin or something like that. But I think it's bad. Now, as I say, maybe one has to step back and say, why should we be surprised? Most politicians, the most of thousands of years of history have wanted to impose their views on other people, haven't been very respectful of the rule of law, haven't thought that, I need to treat other people whom I don't care for much or who don't look like me, who come from a different background. I don't need to treat them equally. And so that's just sort of coming back here in the US. In some parts of the world, it never really went away much. Never really went away fully here. I mean, if we can be honest, it's not as if we didn't have, leave aside even race, which is a huge thing to leave aside, but let's include race. But then also just obviously all the ways in which we didn't live up, you might say, to kind of a higher view of liberal ideas. But even so, we were able to mostly suppress illiberalism or contain it or gradually move beyond it. And now the momentum, I think, has gone the other way. And this is why people like me were never Trump. It's like so many people were, what are you so upset about? And you don't like him. I understand you don't like him, Bill, but I mean, it won't be the end of the world. And the tweets, that's all you care about, right? That he's kind of vulgar. And you try to explain to people, no, he's really a danger to liberal democracy, maybe not personally, but once you unleash this stuff, it is hard to put it back. People get used to it. People like being bullies. And just like in a playground or in a school situation where once you unleash the bullying, it's pretty hard it has a sort of momentum of its own. Some people like it, other people get intimidated by it. Other people feel they have to do it almost to defend themselves. And suddenly it spins out of control, or gradually it spins out of control, sometimes suddenly. And I do think, the situation we've come to here. It's an asymmetric problem. It's much more on the right than on the left. At other times in American history and world history, has been more on the left, or as much on the left. Obviously, the fellow travelers with communism, the rationalizers and justifiers of the purges and so forth. And it really does need to be fought. And liberalism needs to be defended aggressively, the case for it made, and also not just the case, but the institutions fought for, and both globally, I would say, and here at home. So I do think, yes, I think it's a big moment. It's not just a normal, gee, I kind of think the tax rates are too high, or I'm worried about some of their policies here type of moment. I think it's a big moment. Center right and center left should be able to come together to defend liberal democracy and make the case for it.
Yeah, I think, and this gets at, what I've thought about. Your colleague at the Bulwark, Jonathan Last, ran a great piece in talking about Russia that I think is kind of along these lines, which is, and when we bring up the idea of, this isn't just about the spread of this stuff domestically in the US, it's about the international system and what it can be. And right, the idea that a lot of the people on the sort of illiberal right in the US now who are cheering on Putin, a lot of it comes down to, this is what they wish they could have here. And also, I think I made an argument about a year ago for ARCO on these lines of, this is what they want the international community to look like. If we can say that there was a liberal world order, whether people want to kind of get into the, how effective setting that up was, that's for another kind of debate. But there's if we can say there was a liberal world order that's operated pretty successfully since World War II in a lot of ways, and certainly since the end of the Soviet Union, then they kind of want an illiberal world where we are sort of strongman figures who exert themselves in these ways are taken as a kind of given, and certainly are even as a model. Right? These kind of ideas of it's preposterous in its propaganda, but it's I think correct to say it's aspirational when some of these people come out and say, Tucker Carlson or someone else comes out and says, Putin is leading a great Christian nation or a great kind of moral nation, right? Like. Whether or not I don't even know. Some of them probably believe it, but more, I think what they see is a structure of power that they would like to emulate, and that they want to kind of present to Americans and other people as a good thing. I think I love the conversations about in this country about Ukraine. In some ways, I think have reignited some people's commitment to the idea of democracy. Although I think that a lot of the conversations now are appropriately sort of practical policy ones about sort of what's going to happen, if the United States can't sort of hold the line and hold on and do something like, say, re-elect Joe Biden and not send Donald Trump back to the White House. But I also think those big conversations that are more at the macro level of, is there still a kind of sustaining energy to defend the idea that liberal democracy is actually the best system, are also really crucial. And I guess I'm curious. I think there are people who look at that and say, well, that's overheated. There really aren't that many. There are Republicans who do still, like Biden, believe that we have to protect Ukraine and we have to step up and promote democracy in Europe and abroad. But I'm curious how, I guess, reasonable you think that my level of fear is about that.
Yeah, of course it's reasonable. I mean, we're having the largest land war in Europe in 80 years, probably the largest war in the world, I suppose, in 40 years, maybe, since Iraq or Iran, if that was larger than Russia, Ukraine. And really a conducted fun, a really genocidal way almost. We've got China, which was mixed bag, but maybe liberalizing a little bit 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. Certainly economically, even to some degree politically, or at least not getting worse now. Xi tightening the controls, threatening Taiwan and exporting, building relationships all over the world. India, which has been sort of a great hope for democracy, now not so great. Modi's authoritarianism. They're all watching each other. They're in alliance with each other, a lot of the authoritarian regimes, Saudis, Iran, Russia, China, and they have some momentum. And here in the U.S., people aren't sure of our willingness to stay the course, because what if Trump wins? And now what if DeSantis, who originally one thought might be okay in Ukraine, and go with the sort of other Republicans who are still willing to defend, leave aside traditional American foreign policy or the rules-based liberal world order, just decency against barbarity, barbarism. It turns out DeSantis, not so much so, not under the pressure of Trump. So no, I think it's very alarming around the world. It's alarming here. What if Trump wins? I mean, let's just be, what are the odds? Trump's got to be 50% chance to be the Republican nominee. Republicans got to have, 40% chance to win the White House. So I can't do the math in my head probably quite accurately, but maybe 20% chance of him being the next president. That might even be a tad low. I don't know. DeSantis wouldn't be great either, incidentally, but I mean, that's really bad. I mean, if people reelect him, after January 6th was supposed to end him. We were not supposed to be willing to consider as the next president someone who tried to overturn the preceding election he was in. Richard Nixon was not a candidate in 76 or 80. And no one thought, that's a good idea. Why don't the Republicans try to get Nixon again, even though he didn't serve out that second term? Maybe he could get another 4 years. I mean, it's just the degree to which we have normalized a certain type of authoritarianism, illiberalism around the world to some degree. It's not there. We don't control it exactly. But certainly here at home, now I don't, normalizing maybe is not fair because we have to deal with it. I'm not saying we can wish it away, but we need to be serious about fighting this. I very much agree with that.
Something that we've been talking around, and that I think is a very provocative part of this debate, is the question of how much 2016 unleashed this stuff and how much it was there. And I think there's a way that question gets asked that I think is very unfair to some Republicans. But there's also a way, I think, to pose the question that is not entirely unreasonable, where you can say, look, there were strong strains, and there were, as we've said, the problem has been on the American left before. Today it's asymmetrical and it's on the right, but the stuff we were seeing on the right before Trump was there. It was brewing, right? That there were ways in which the sort of shoots were poking up above the ground beforehand. Even just looking at if not in terms of what he was doing, the way the kind of hardball Newt Gingrich was willing to play in the House, and some of the rhetoric that was used at the time, beginning to call Democrats degenerate and sick, and some of the stuff that I think it would be hard to say it didn't set the stage. And so, I want to also approach this with a kind of long event idea of, how do we differentiate what I think clearly is a different moment? It is a different moment. I don't think it's fair to say that that things have not changed, that we're not living in something that is distinct from 2008. But at the same time, that continuity from disjuncture. And I think that's a really big problem for a lot of us. Also because there's obviously, I think it's hard to get away from the feeling that we are sort of leveling accusations that may or may not be fair whenever we talk about the Trump moment being more of a continuity than it is a break, for what it's worth.
It's more of a break. I don't find this. I mean, look, of course, there were evidences of it. There always have been. There always have been. There's never been a democratic politics that didn't have demagogues, that didn't have racists, certainly in the U.S. Some of us went along with some of them too much. I totally plead guilty to that. Some of us also fought them. I spent the 90s fighting Pat Buchanan. I was very pleased. I said I wouldn't vote for him if he were the Republican nominee in 1961, I believe, or almost won first primary that year. I said I wouldn't vote for Ron Paul. Some of us fought against some of this stuff, but we also didn't fight against certain things hard enough, probably, or effectively enough that we might have. We rationalized certain things. Absolutely guilty of that, if you want to call it that. But I would also say you're never going to have a party that's perfect. You're never going to have 60 million people, none of whom is flawed, or 220 members of the House or whatever. Huge, huge difference when that is part of a party, a minority part of a party, usually, part of a party that's maybe under the surface a little stronger than it should be, considerably stronger than it should be, but not governing the party and not nominated by the party to be president of the United States. This is a party that nominated Reagan and Bush and Dole and Bush and McCain and Romney. That's pretty different from Donald Trump. And that's, again, I come back to this. That's why I was I wouldn't have been this never Trump if I weren't worried that, of course, there was stuff for him to exploit. He would have just been a flaky idiot, business guy who was running. Maybe he would win the nomination once, but it couldn't go anywhere. But I saw it. A lot of people saw. I wasn't at all unique. That he was tapping into something. Some of it was, you could argue, understandable. We're all supposed to say that, and globalization and cultural change. I'm somewhat unhappy with, and intolerance, not quite the right word, but what is the word I'm looking for? But, so I'm not really in favor of indulging these excuses too much. People have agency. People don't have to support racists. People can be upset about parts of globalization or parts of cultural change without becoming bigots, and if they become bigots, that's mostly on them. Now, as a matter of social science and policy, we should minimize the excuses and the occasions and the incentives and the spurs that lead people down that road, given that people's characters are very mixed and complicated. And so I don't mean to say that we don't have to care about all that. We couldn't have done things better from policy point of view in certain ways. But again, this is why Trump was so dangerous, because he was tapping into things that were there on the right, or that were just there in America. And this is why his nomination was very dangerous, because it was very different from the preceding nominees. Very different to have one senator, or even a powerful one for a while, Joe McCarthy, or even, one or two or 10 or 20 in the Senate or the House, or a governor. Very, very different from being the nominee of a major party, which in turn is very different from being the president of the United States. And once he was president, there was a tiny bit of hope. There's some hope, well, he'd be more responsible. The office would constrain him. And that wasn't crazy to hope. It wasn't crazy to work for that. I encouraged people I knew to go in, not encouraged, but I certainly talked to people I knew about going into the administration, and many of them did go in, and I didn't criticize them publicly. I didn't criticize them privately. I thought, if you can do good, if you can prevent Trump from making catastrophic decisions in foreign policy or economic policy or other things, you should do so. It's going to be unpleasant for you, but it's the right thing. And a lot of people did a lot of good. I'm not one of those who condemns everyone who's ever set foot in the Trump administration or the Trump White House or in Trump's Republican Party. Having said that, the degree of accommodation and acquiescence and rationalization pretty quickly became unacceptable, unnecessary, and super, super dangerous. That's why things are so dangerous now. Trump could have become a president kind of without a party. Party could have gone on its own way, checking Trump, giving him some legislative victories where they agreed with him, but not becoming Trumpist. But the party chose to become Trumpist. The voters wanted it to become Trumpist, to be fair to the party. So there was they were doing what the voters wanted, but they could have fought against and tried to educate the voters. Very little of that. And so now we got, by 2020, a president running for re-election with a party united behind him. So half of the country, basically, half of the country's elected officials most of them pretty enthusiastically for Trump, and almost all of them actually for Trump. Very few people. I mean, some of us there were Republicans for Biden, some of us did Republican voters against Trump and all, but those were not huge numbers. I think they were important, maybe decisive numbers in the election. Then January 6th happens, and that's the moment where they could turn on him. And 17 Republican senators could have voted to convict him after he was impeached, and really would have repudiated him. Probably couldn't have run again, even legally at that point. And also just would have been a big moment. And they chose not to. And they can excuse, the voters didn't want them to. They might have lost their primaries, which some of them did the next year, the ones who voted to impeach. But, really, is there never a time when you should stand up and do the right thing for the country as opposed to your short-term political survival? So here we are, all that accommodation and rationalization. I do think, though, to get to your point, none of this was inevitable. None of it came out of nowhere either, though. You're absolutely right about that. And we need to be honest and look back, just the way, to use a wildly exaggerated counterpart example, in Germany, people did look back and wrote very intelligent things about where this had all come from and what strains in German culture and politics and so forth had made this possible. But still, it wasn't inevitable there, and it wasn't inevitable here. And people should be sort of held accountable for what actually the choices they have actually made over the last several years. But final point, his being president is very important, I think, in this analysis. People underestimate that. We don't, the presidency is a powerful office. Now, the president Trump could have, said, look, I said a few of these things while I was running, but I'm going to try to be a little more restrained as president, and I'm going to try to govern for all the people. I'm still going to have tough policies that some of you guys won't like, anti-NATO, pro-America first, protectionist, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to even indulge some of the bigotry a little bit. I wouldn't say it that way, but I'm going to, I'm not going to, but he was the opposite, right? He just hammered on it every day, the divisiveness, the incendiary rhetoric, the demagoguery. And that we've paid a huge price for. We have not had that. I don't know that we've ever had that in American politics. Maybe mid-19th century, but I don't think so. Just relentless demagoguery from the top office in the land. We have a presidential system. We only have one president. It's not like the prime minister where he just kind of is the top minister representing, his party that controls parliament. President really represents the U.S. as the head of state as well as the head of government. And Trump just spent 4 years unleashing all these toxins into the body politic. And he's still there, and they're still there. If he goes away, I think it might be easier to push them back, but they're not going away immediately, unfortunately.
So I have a couple of diverging thoughts that spring to mind from all of that. And one, I want to say, I think it's a very compelling answer, and also I'll express personally I don't think enough people who come from a more center-left tradition like myself express often enough the appreciation for people like yourself and others at the Bulwark and other institutions that have.
No need for
I mean this because I'm not being flattering. I think the personal sacrifices in politics of losing friends and criticizing people that you used to work with and taking steps to really speak forcefully on this stuff is commendable, and also one of those things that I'm very much in the kind of camp of team democracy now, right? I'm less interested in the recriminations about what Reagan said or what Bill Clinton did or a couple of things that spring from that response that I think about. One is, I think that what you're getting at, that a lot of people are now, I think, pointing to, which is we're well past the point now where this is a question of when will sort of Trump personally exhaust himself as a political force, right? McCarthy did eventually kind of just render himself kind of laughable on the national stage, and Nixon was brought down by a criminal. So I think the situation with Trump, at one point there might have been that hope of, this is about him, right? And the indictments even are still sort of surrounded by some of that sort of, I think, overly hopeful speculation that this is about bringing him down. But when you talk about unleashing this stuff, I guess, how do you think about the way? Because history is such that political forces do typically eventually exhaust themselves in one way or another. How do you think about the way that this particular stuff that's been unleashed does eventually kind of play out or exhaust itself? I'm not being I don't mean to be sort of suggesting that we can just sit back and like watch it happen, but I mean, we're complacent in any way. But I just that how do you think about the way that this stuff does eventually kind of reach its end of life?
Look, I think you have to be very analytical about what we can do to speed up its end of life and strengthen institutions to beat it back while it's alive and vigorous, and in case it has a resurgence of life and so forth. I mean, this is whatever metaphors we like, biological or other kinds. I mean, if it's a disease, we need to figure out what antibiotics are needed, and then what operations are needed, and what surgery and what corrective things can be done to the body politic and so forth. So, no, I think you're absolutely right that this is just because we're fighting doesn't mean we don't have to analyze. Quite the contrary, it's much more urgent than it is in the past. And some of those people won't agree on, and some of them are longer term, and we shouldn't let the best be the enemy of the good. We shouldn't let the longer term totally overtake the shorter term. I've had many arguments, and pleasant, polite and pleasant arguments, disagreements really, of emphasis with some of my never Trump friends, or until the whole party system gets fixed, or you can't fix any of this, or until social media gets changed, we can't fix any of this, or until our culture gets changed, or you name it, a million different problems. And I resist that some, because even though I'm personally quite interested in a lot of these things, and my own background is more in political philosophy, and I think you're trying to think a little more systematically and over the longer term about some of these things. I also think when you're fighting, to use the medical analogy once again, when you're fighting an infection, you need to get the infection out of there. You can fix, you can then begin the therapy, the recuperation, the strengthening of the body. But if the infection is running loose, you die before you can do any of the longer term stuff. So that's one point I would make. And the other point I would make is I would just say, you're right. These things they go in waves. They sometimes exhaust themselves, these kind of populist movements. But sometimes they don't exhaust themselves for quite a long time, or they set up systems that can last sometimes not very long because they're so extreme, or they lead to war, which is its own ghastly outcome, of course, and sometimes for quite a long time, actually. So, Putin's been there 20 years, a long time in Russia, getting worse and worse. Orban, 12 years. Others, God knows, there are plenty of instances in history and so forth. So, China, it's getting better for a while, but then it gets worse again. So, you really, the exhaustion metaphor maybe isn't, it has too much of an implicit assumption. I'm not saying you had this, but I think the metaphor itself has this in a way of, at some point, we're going to get back to normal. But I just think there's not a natural correction to normal in this case. Liberalism is a political system. I would argue that ultimately it's more in accord with human nature and probably with human inclinations and maybe a little bit with historical development, so that it is a little more normal, if you want to put it that way, than various forms of dictatorship. But one can make the opposite argument, incidentally. Populist dictatorship is a lot easier to maintain and easier to explain to people than the complexities of liberalism, separation of powers, rule of law, markets, why all these things are ultimately good, even though they don't short-term necessarily don't seem to be in your interest. Tuckle spent a lot of time saying it's very important that Americans think of their enlightened self-interest well understood, because normally you just think of your narrow self-interest, and that can lead you in a very illiberal direction. So I worry a little that the notion that we can just, and you've made clear that's not what you were saying, that you can just sit back and wait, but that the notion of exhaustion is a little misleading almost, could be misleading. And that, liberalism can get exhausted. And we think of it now, would like to think, there's a challenge, we're going to overcome it. I hope we do. I think we will. But it could also be a moment where, with the illiberalism, assume some new forms and get some new leaders and second generation, third generation. And we're in a very bad place. So making the case for liberalism, explaining to people why it's in their interest, short-term and more importantly, even long-term, getting people to think in a more long-term way, getting people to think more responsibly about politics and society, all those things are it's a big task. It's a big task. It is an interesting moment. I think it's an exciting moment for younger people like you, because it really is a chance, make a huge difference. What's the 21st century going to look like? The century of Putin and Orban and Xi and at best like Modi, taking what would look to be a flourishing, pluralist liberal democracy, and gradually turning it into a sort of ethno-nationalist one? Is that what the 21st century is going to be? And then how all these new technologies going to get used, if that's the political and social context into which they emerge? I mean, we take for granted that a lot of these technologies have been mostly forces for good, but they've been forces for good because they've come into a system of the rule of law and liberal democracy and respect for individuals and stuff, where mostly, not always, mostly they've been used in ways to help people, not to simply, in a 1984 Brave New World sort of way, crush them. So anyway, I don't mean to exaggerate this, but it is a very big moment, I think. And it's not a moment that's going to be resolved in the next month or year, but this next decade or so, I mean, it's it's really an inflection point, I think.
What you said there, and then it's actually still the other thing that kind of sparked from your previous answer, which is this issue of a lot of what we've been talking about when we talk about illiberalism, right? Is this kind of intolerance of pluralism, this unwillingness to tolerate difference and distinction and dissent. But I think there's a lot of really people who are trying to be good liberals, in that big tent sense we mean, who are also struggling with this, and that happens in the conversations around freedom of speech, particularly, and not really. I don't really mean this as much in the kind of legal sense, because I think the actual amount of times that someone's sort of legal First Amendment rights are being threatened are fairly few, but the broader sort of cultural context of embracing freedom of expression, a kind of attitude about expression that's open-minded and open-ended is I think where we see a lot of contention. And I think one of the real, and you mentioned obviously, right, even when we were talking about roots of things, you talk about people have done a great job of looking at the roots of Nazi Germany and the period that preceded it, Weimar Germany, right, being very famously in some ways quite tolerant and free-flowing a society, at least in certain places like 1920s Berlin. I think one of the things that I find really challenging, and that I think even people who want to be good liberals might find challenging, is the issue that the adage that freedom of speech is about a marketplace of ideas, and the good ideas just sort of will always sort of win out, right? In the same way that sort of like, a good product sells and good companies survive and bad things flop. I don't think that's true. And the real challenge is that the scary thing about this proposition is bad ideas, scary ideas, illiberal, authoritarian principles and arguments can win out. And we still sort of have to be committed to the environment that allows quite frightening things to be expressed and be committed to winning out in that environment. I think that is, in many ways, a fundamental distinction. We can't sort of blithely hope or even just sort of assume that, well, good politics will just sort of, people will, if you have freedom of expression, everyone just sort of hears all the different ideas. And it's obvious that the stuff that's sort of bad and prejudicial and cruel or thing, well, that'll just get sifted out by the public and sort of that competition of ideas. Clearly, no. I mean, the public often, repeatedly throughout history, has an appetite for these things.
Yeah, and
it's such a trick to commit to them. Right.
Intellectuals also fall in love with the liberal ideas. It's not like most intellectuals in the 30s were necessarily standing up for liberalism. Look, I very much agree with your formulation. My only slight qualification of it is I think there's the notion that the free market of ideas would always produce the best ideas. The free market of goods doesn't always produce the best goods. Some good companies go and some bad companies do well. They cater to people's bad tastes or just confuse people or deceive them almost into what they should want. But more importantly, in the idea, the serious defenders of liberalism have never been sunny optimists about the free market of ideas. John Stuart Mill, read on liberty as you have, but other people need to read it. The most famous, I guess you'd say, liberal statement, sort of caricatured in a cartoonish way, often by conservatives or by those on the left. It's very naive and all. What's the core defense of liberty? Because bad ideas often dominate. And if you don't have a commitment to liberty, the good ideas won't be able to be there to challenge from a minority stance the bad ideas. Was Tocqueville optimistic about tyranny of the majority? No, but again, that's why he says somewhere at the end of democracy in America. In other ages, I would have liked freedom. I think he says respect, but in this age, I'm inclined to revere it. I mean, precisely because of the dangers in modern democracy and modern life, modern technology, to the better ideas and the better ways of life and the better sentiments. It's why we need to be attached more strongly to liberty, not less so. So I very much agree. We shouldn't have a kind of, obviously we want to believe, and we should, that at the end, more often than not, this will result in better policies, et cetera, and better ideas if people could get a good hearing. But we shouldn't be foolishly optimistic, or kind of certainly not complacently optimistic about this. As I say, it's precisely the whole point is that we need to defend minorities. We need to defend those who are disfavored. We need to not let people embrace whatever's the trendy scientific or religious or secular, I guess, favorite idea of the time, and use it as an excuse for illiberal policies. This is where I do think some of the American liberal sort of optimism, the arc of history always bends towards justice. You can see what people mean by that, and which King had a certain religious background, which is obviously fair or fine, but people say it too quickly. The arc of history can go in a very bad direction for a long time, and people need to be. I mean, I've always liked Bill Buckley. Certainly American conservatives has plenty of problems, and Buckley himself was by no means unproblematic at National Review. But I've always thought it was good when he launched National Review that he said, we stand to thwart history, yelling stop, I think was the phrase. Because whatever that meant, and in some cases it might mean he was defending some bad things, incidentally, against progress, like segregation, So I'm not going to defend that at all. But that's why I wasn't one reason I wasn't a kind of Buckley conservative to start. I was a Scoop Jackson, Democrat. But the notion that you can stand against history, yelling stop, that you don't necessarily go with the flow, which wherever things seem to be going. That's a very important principle, not just principle, but kind of spirit, I would almost say, to uphold. And I don't think liberal democracy can ultimately flourish without that spirit, either among the public as a whole, or certainly among intellectuals, leaders, elected officials.
Right. Now, I think that's very right. And, it's one of those things where I think the instinct, right, is you even hear people say, well, clearly we should be restraining the speech. And that's, if we didn't allow all these sort of bad people to find each other and talk loudly with one another, wouldn't this happen? I think that's a very, like you said, sort of sunny idea about how bad stuff bubbles up to the surface in the first place. But also, there's so many wonderful things, I think, out in. And this is not, like you said, this is not a blind optimism, but there's lots of really creative and energetic ideas out in the public space now, in the public square, that wouldn't be there without some of these platforms and places that offer relatively unfettered opportunities for people to speak their minds and share ideas with each other. So I've loved this conversation, and I am really appreciative that you took the time to do it. I have a chatter question that is the traditional question on this podcast, because Pulaski is so committed to this kind of idea of heartlands and places maybe away from the traditional centers. I try to twist that somewhat into a question for people about some of their favorite places, in terms of whether it's bookshops or restaurants or parks or whatever. But the idea is sort of somewhere a little more off the path, where if someone is in a given place, you would say, this is the thing you need to go and try or check out or visit that might give you some enjoyment, because we're all about promoting the places that maybe sometimes go under unnoticed and overlooked. So I'm curious, and I realize I didn't prime you, so you're having to go off the cuff, I'll say. But that is my sort of chatter question to you. What's your suggestion? You can feel free. I know you've lived a pretty wide ranging life, so I'm interested to hear what you might offer up.
It's an interesting last question. I haven't had that wide ranging life, so I'm actually a bad person to answer this question. So I'll do so anyway. But I mean, I grew up in New York. I'm actually in a hotel room in New York as we speak, on the Upper West Side, just a few blocks from where I grew up. And then I went to school in Boston, and then taught in Philly at Penn, and then back to Boston to teach, and then to Washington, in the Washington area, where we've been for, I guess almost 40 years. raised our kids and stuff. And I have lived entirely on the Acela corridor. If you want to picture someone who's out of touch with Middle America, that's me. Now, of course, I've traveled around a lot, and I like to think I have a lot of friends from around the country, and I like to think in my tastes, actually, I'm pretty Middle American in some ways, and movies and TV and sports and all that kind of thing. But so I'm not some kind of elitist snob. I don't think, but I don't pretend to have be in intimate touch with the heartland, and so I'm. So the places that I'm nostalgic about are actually when I walked out of the hotel this morning, and just 4 blocks from where I grew up, 2 blocks from where I went to school. So but that's the Upper West Side of New York, which is not, as I say, exactly the heartland. So I'm probably not a very good example of this. I would say, I don't know. I have very conventional, I guess, view of this. The places I find most moving, something though, and I've been several times, not a huge number though. I probably should have gone more. I say Civil War battlefields, for example. The idea that you go to Gettysburg and you see this climactic battle, the Civil War, the read about it, you can really see it as you've probably been. I mean, you can really see how the battle went there, unlike some of the battlefields that are sort of built over almost, or changed so much over 100 years, either from natural growth or from, development. Obviously, Manassas, near where I live, pretty close to where I live, is like a nice suburb, and there's a couple of battlefield markers. I'm exaggerating a little, in the middle of, normal Northern Virginia developments. But Gettysburg is pretty, you can see where the Pickett's charge was and so forth. And then, of course, the cemetery where Lincoln gave the speech 6 months later or so. And, that I really always find it moving to be there. And I think that's generally true of some of the Civil War battles. We're very lucky in this country. We don't have many, didn't have many wars fought on our soil. The Revolution, a little bit of 1812, and the Civil War. So it's not like being in Europe where it's very moving, but you can, it's like half of France and, obviously the Low Countries and stuff are, were battlefields at different times and pretty recently, and terribly bloody ones. So I don't know if that's maybe not a very good, but I do, when foreigners say, where should I go apart from New York and Washington, I do try to encourage them. Sometimes, Gettysburg is an hour and a half from Washington. Take a day there. I think it's really interesting and moving. Civil War, the more you think about it, it's such a huge moment in American history. Still living with a lot of the living with, of course, the success, but also now this is something as a conservative I've really changed my mind about. I mean, become more liberal, so to speak. It's also living with a lot of the failures to carry through on the promise, as it were, of the Civil War and Reconstruction and so forth, and still some of the challenges that Lincoln talks about, certainly in the Lyceum speech and some of the speeches in the 1850s, about public sentiment and about the difficulty of holding to decent principles in politics, and the dangers of popular sovereignty, as it was called then, which was a kind of populism. Whatever the people want is right. There's so much that's resonant for me for that era. So I guess I'm kind of a Civil War. This is a very conventional answer. A Civil War guy and a Gettysburg guy.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. A lot of my dad's side is from Southeast Pennsylvania and Northern Delaware, and so we went when I was a kid, and
yeah,
more Americans should be Civil War people, especially now. I think in the sense of not that we should have another Civil War, but that they should. They should. I think we spend a lot of this conversation talking about the need to fight for these ideas and to really not be complacent, but to sort of meet them. And I think more Americans should engage with that history, especially as a history about that particular idea about meeting these kinds of ideas and having to face them down. So I really, Bill Kristol, appreciate you taking the time to do this. I will happily tell everyone that they should read the Bulwark, because I'm a daily. I listen to it all. By the way, I'm a Charlie Sykes. I listen to The Next Level. I listen to the Secret Pod. Sarah Longwell fan. I listen to it all.
It's amazing you have time to do your own podcast here, but that's good.
Thank
you for that. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah. So been wonderful, and I hope you have an excellent remainder of your time in New York.
Thank you.
The Periphery is a production of the Pulaski Institution. I've been your host, Alan Elrod. Our music was written, recorded, and produced by Brandon Ragsdale and Cody Smith. Thank you for coming, and please join us next time.